Welcome to my channel where we share powerful stories of medical malpractice, negligence, and the real human struggles behind hospital walls. If you care about truth and lessons from these mistakes, you're in the right place. Let's begin today's story. Robert Hayes had never been the kind of man who thought much about hospitals. He was a strong construction supervisor who spent most of his life on job sites, guiding crews and taking pride in the buildings he helped raise. But kidney disease had begun to break down that strength piece by piece until the pain and exhaustion could no longer be ignored. And when doctors finally told him his left kidney had failed and needed to be removed, he felt both fear and relief. Fear because surgery was something he had never faced before, and relief because at last there was a clear plan to take away the pain that had been haunting him for months. His wife Linda sat by his side during the consultation, squeezing his hand and whispering that everything would be fine. His children called more often than usual, their voices carrying the love and concern that reminded him how much he had to live for. And in the days leading up to the procedure, he found himself appreciating small details he normally overlooked. The taste of morning coffee, the warmth of the sun on his porch, the quiet peace of the neighborhood waking up, and he prayed quietly at night, asking for safe hands to guide the doctors. On the morning of the operation, he dressed in comfortable clothes and rode with Linda to the hospital before dawn, the streets empty but his mind full of restless thoughts. At the check-in desk, everything felt routine for the staff, papers, forms, signatures, yet to Robert, it was the threshold of something life-changing. A nurse eventually called his name and led him through long antiseptic-smelling corridors to the pre-op room, where he changed into a gown while Linda sat beside him, never letting go of his hand, promising she would be there when he woke up. The anesthesiologist explained the process with calm confidence, words Robert barely heard because he was focusing on the professionalism of the team, the way they moved with certainty, the way their confidence calmed his nerves. Soon he was wheeled into the operating room, a blindingly bright place filled with the hum of machines, the beep of monitors, and the metallic shine of surgical instruments neatly arranged. The air felt cold against his skin, and masked figures moved around him preparing equipment, adjusting drapes, and murmuring in a language of medicine he did not understand. He felt a surge of fear in his chest but tried to steady himself by thinking of Linda's hand, his children's voices, and the life waiting for him after this was all over. The anesthesiologist lowered the mask over his face and spoke softly, telling him he would be asleep before he knew it. Robert inhaled the sharp smell of the gas, his body going heavy, his vision fading, and in his last conscious thought he told himself that he was safe, that these people knew exactly what they were doing, that when he woke up the pain would be gone and the nightmare of his kidney disease would finally be behind him. But what he did not know, what no one in his family knew, was that at that very moment a mistake was already unfolding in the sterile, bright, silent room, a mistake that would change his life forever. Inside the operating room, the team moved with routine precision. Charts were checked, monitors adjusted, instruments laid out on sterile trays. And yet in the quiet urgency of that morning, a single oversight began to ripple through the process unnoticed. The surgical site had been marked incorrectly. And while the paperwork clearly stated that Robert's diseased left kidney was to be removed, a combination of rushed preparation, poor communication, and assumption led the team to focus on the right side. The healthy side, the surgeon, confident in the information before him, made the first incision without realizing the magnitude of the mistake that was unfolding. The anesthesiologist monitored Robert's breathing and heart rate. The nurses handed instruments with practice timing, and everything seemed to flow seamlessly as the organ was carefully detached and lifted out. But what none of them realized was that they had just taken the kidney that was keeping Robert alive, while the diseased one still remained inside him. In those sterile white walls, under the bright surgical lights, an irreversible error had been made, one that no checklist or apology could undo. The operation was closed. The team congratulated themselves on a job well done, and Robert was wheeled into recovery with everyone believing the procedure had been a success. But within hours, the truth would begin to surface, and the consequences of this fatal mistake would ripple through his life, his family, and the hospital in ways none of them could yet imagine. Robert slowly drifted back to consciousness, the haze of anesthesia lifting like a heavy fog. His mouth dry, his body aching, and a dull pain spreading across his side. At first he thought this was normal, that the surgery had gone as planned, but something felt wrong. His chest felt heavy, his breathing shallow, and his body weaker than he expected. Linda was at his bedside, her eyes red from hours of waiting. She smiled when his eyes opened, but the relief in her face quickly gave way to concern as Robert whispered that he felt worse, not better. Soon doctors and nurses gathered, their voices low, their glances quick and uneasy. Tests were ordered. Monitors beeped faster, and the room filled with a tension Robert could sense even through the fog of medication. Hours later, the surgeon returned, his expression carefully controlled, his words measured, but the weight of what he said shattered the silence. They had removed the wrong kidney, his healthy right kidney was gone, and the diseased one remained inside him. Robert stared at him in disbelief, his mind refusing to process what he was hearing. Linda gasped, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. The world seemed to tilt, the trust they had placed in the hospital collapsing in an instant. Instead of a future of healing, Robert now faced a lifetime of dialysis, possible transplant, and permanent dependence on a system that had just failed him in the most devastating way. The betrayal was total, the mistake irreversible, and as the reality sank in, Robert realized his life would never be the same again. The days after the surgery blurred into a nightmare that Robert could not escape. Instead of moving toward recovery, he was now tethered to machines that hummed and clicked as they filtered the blood his body could no longer manage on its own. Dialysis began almost immediately, a process that drained him of energy and time, leaving him exhausted and weak, each session a reminder of the organ he had lost, not to disease but to negligence. Linda stayed by his side, holding his hand through the treatments, though he could see the toll it took on her, the sleepless nights, the constant worry, the way her smile had turned into something fragile and forced. Their children visited often, trying to stay positive, but Robert noticed the fear in their eyes whenever they looked at him, as if they were already grieving the life he had lost. Medical bills piled up, adding financial stress to their emotional pain, and Robert's career in construction came to an abrupt end, his strong hands that once built homes now shaking with fatigue after a single hour of work around the house. The hospital sent representatives to speak with them, offering careful apologies that felt more like rehearsed scripts than genuine remorse, promising investigations, but nothing they said could restore the trust that had been shattered. For Robert, every glance in the mirror was a reminder that his independence had been stolen, his future rewritten by a mistake that never should have happened. He wrestled with anger, despair, and the crushing thought that the rest of his life would be defined not by the disease he had been fighting, but by the error of those who were supposed to heal him. Inside the hospital walls, the mistake sent shockwaves. But instead of open acknowledgement, there was an immediate scramble to contain the damage. Administrators called emergency meetings, lawyers were brought in, and public relations staff began drafting statements that emphasized sympathy without admitting full responsibility. Behind closed doors, doctors and nurses whispered about what had happened, some horrified that such an error had slipped through, others terrified that speaking out could cost them their careers. Official reports were carefully worded, shifting blame toward miscommunication, suggesting that Robert's case was a tragic accident rather than a preventable act of negligence. Linda and Robert were visited by hospital representatives who spoke in polished tones, assuring them that an investigation was underway, that steps would be taken to ensure such a mistake never happened again. But their words rang hollow, scripted phrases that felt designed to protect the institution more than the patient. Meanwhile, the surgeon who had performed the operation submitted his account, pointing to the missing surgical checklist, the unclear markings on Robert's body, and the chaotic environment of the operating room as contributing factors. Yet Robert could not escape the thought that no matter how many excuses were made, his healthy kidney was gone forever. And the hospital seemed more focused on its reputation than on his suffering. For Linda, the anger grew sharper each time she replayed the conversations, each time she remembered how confidently the surgeon had reassured them before the operation, the weight of betrayal becoming unbearable. It was clear to both of them that the truth would not come freely, and that if they wanted justice, they would have to fight for it themselves. When Robert and Linda finally met with an attorney, the decision felt less like a choice and more like survival, because the hospital's polished apologies had done nothing to ease their suffering or cover the cost of endless treatments. So the lawyer listened carefully, reviewed the medical files, and within weeks, a lawsuit was filed that shook the hospital into full defense mode. Suddenly, Robert was not just a patient but a plaintiff. His story transformed into a case number, his pain dissected in legal terms. Depositions were scheduled, expert witnesses called, and the courtroom became the stage where the truth would be fought over like a prize. The hospital's lawyers argued that it had been a tragic accident, a rare occurrence that no one could have foreseen, but Robert's team pointed to the missing safety protocols, the ignored checklists, and the surgeon's failure to confirm the correct kidney before the first incision. Linda testified with quiet strength, describing the man her husband used to be and the life that had been taken from them. Robert himself took the stand, his voice shaking as he described waking up to the news that his healthy kidney was gone. The jury listened intently, their faces grim, while medical experts explained in clear terms how the error could only have happened through negligence. Every detail exposed the gap between what should have been done and what actually happened. And as the trial stretched on, the hospital's polished image began to crack under the weight of facts. The courtroom became a place of reckoning. And for the first time since the surgery, Robert felt that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening to the truth. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and long days in court, The case finally came to its conclusion, the air inside the courtroom heavy with tension as the jury filed back into their seats. Robert sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands trembling in Linda's grasp, his heart pounding as he tried to steady his breath. When the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, the words seemed to hang in the air. The hospital had been found negligent, the jury agreeing that Robert's suffering was the direct result of preventable medical error, and they awarded damages meant to cover his medical costs, his lost income, and the pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. Linda wept quietly, relief and sorrow mixing in her tears, while Robert closed his eyes, not celebrating but simply absorbing the weight of recognition. The truth had been acknowledged, and though no amount of money could restore the kidney he had lost or the life he once lived, there was a sense of justice in knowing that the system had not ignored him. Across the aisle, the hospital's representatives sat stiffly, their faces pale, their reputation tarnished, their polished defenses collapsed under the reality of their mistake. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, microphones thrust forward as the family gave a brief statement. Robert speaking softly about accountability, about the importance of safety and honesty in medicine. His words carrying not anger but a plea that no other patient endure what he had suffered. The cameras flashed, the crowd murmured, and as Robert and Linda walked down the courthouse steps hand in hand, they knew that the battle had been won, but the war for healing, the daily struggle with dialysis, the endless adjustments to a new reality, was still waiting for them beyond the spotlight of the verdict. In the quiet months that followed the trial, Robert and Linda tried to rebuild some sense of normal life. Though nothing about their world felt the same, every dialysis session was a reminder of the mistake that had stolen his independence. Every medical bill a shadow of the fight they had endured. Yet within the hardship there was also a strange clarity. Robert began to speak at community gatherings and patient advocacy groups, telling his story not for sympathy but to warn others of the dangers when safety protocols are ignored. His words carried weight because they came not from statistics or textbooks but from lived pain, from a life cut in half by negligence. Linda stood with him at each event, her quiet strength serving as proof that families too carry the burden of medical errors. Together they spoke about trust, about the need for patients to ask questions, for hospitals to listen, for doctors to remember that every chart and every incision represents a human life. Their story traveled beyond their small town, reaching newspapers and medical forums, stirring debate about accountability and reform. And while Robert still wrestled with anger on the dark nights when fatigue crushed him, he also found purpose in knowing his voice could help prevent another family from suffering the same fate. The lesson was harsh, and it came at a cost no one should ever have to pay. But it was clear negligence in medicine is not just a mistake, it is a human tragedy, one that leaves scars far deeper than any surgical wound, and the only way forward is to confront it with honesty, accountability, and compassion. Thank you for watching this story. Cases like Robert's remind us how important accountability and honesty are in medicine. If you found this story powerful and want to hear more real accounts of malpractice, negligence, and the lessons we can learn from them, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the next story. Until then, take care and stay safe.